recording. Okay. There's our stream. Good. Om Sahana Vavatu Sahano Bhunaktu Sahavidyan Karava Vahai Tejasvinavadhitamastu ma vidvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om. Good. Welcome back to our local New Jersey students, and welcome also to all of you who are watching this satsang online. We have a lot of great questions, and as always, we'll alternate. We'll get both questions from our local students and online. There are many good questions, as always, and as always, there'll be more questions than we can get to. So I apologize in advance if I don't get to your question. Let me just check this, make sure everything is working. Looks okay. Yeah, it looks okay. All right. First question is from Shiv, who lives in New York. Shiv says, the mind is limited. Atma is infinite in relationship to the limited mind. Okay? And this is a concept. Brahman is neither limited nor infinite. And I'm not sure exactly what that means. If you want to say Brahman is free from qualities, that's fine, but infinite, not finite, means no finitude, no edge, no boundary. So I don't think you can say Brahman is neither limited or infinite. Brahman is infinite. By definition, Brahman has no finitude, no edge, no limit. Also, Atma and Brahman ultimately are discovered to be the same. So you can't say one is infinite and the other is not infinite. So I'm not sure about Shiv's language here, but I think what he's hinting at, there's no questions he asks. What is your understanding of this? I think what his intention is, perhaps, is if these are infinite with regard to the limited mind, how can a limited mind grasp that which is limitless? Do our limited minds have the capacity, the ability to grasp that which is infinite? That's actually a pretty easy question to answer. No, of course not. How can a finite, limited mind grasp that which is infinite? The Taittiriya Upanishad has a famous passage, Yato vacho nivartante aprapya manasa saha, that I'll paraphrase, that the mind and words are utterly incapable of reaching that absolute, that which we call Brahman or Atman. Then the next question is, if our limited, finite minds are incapable of grasping the infinite, then it would be natural to ask, well, then how can we become enlightened? And the answer is, your mind doesn't need to grab on to something called Atma or Brahman. Atma or Brahman is already present as your essential nature. So the mind doesn't need to get it, doesn't need to grasp it, doesn't need to reach it. The problem is the mind doesn't understand properly. The mind, there is the so-called veil of ignorance covering that already present reality called Atma or Brahman. That infinite, limitless reality is already present here and now in your experience, but not recognized. So all the mind, I'm making it sound so simple. Whenever someone says, all you have to do is this, ignore them. That's probably, whatever is coming is usually not very good advice, right? All you have to do is this. People like to oversimplify things, and I certainly don't want to oversimplify these teachings. But it is wrong to think that your true nature, or the reality because of which everything exists, is something out there that you have to chase after, that you have to reach, that you have to attain, that you have to grab. It's, as I said before, it's already here now as your true nature, covered by the so-called veil of ignorance. So all we have to, there it is again, all we have to do. What needs to happen is the so-called veil of ignorance has to be removed. Okay, next question from Stefano, who lives in Spain. Could you give us a deeper understanding of maha samadhi? Is it the final step for liberation from suffering in the concept of Patanjali, the author of Yoga Sutras? Okay. I'm not sure what you mean, what Stefano means by maha samadhi. Patanjali, in his Yoga Sutras, defines samadhi. In fact, he identifies 7 different kinds of samadhi in the Yoga Sutras, and none of them are called maha samadhi. I'm not sure. Maha samadhi might be a term used by some particular group or spiritual tradition. I don't know, because I don't recognize the term. It's not, how can I say, it's not a proper term according to Patanjali. Patanjali hasn't used the term maha samadhi, so suppose we set that term maha samadhi. Patanjali would use terms like savikara, nirvikara samadhi, samadhi which has an object, samadhi which has no object. Now, there are many ways of, as I said, 7 different kinds of samadhi. But just the last part of Stefano's question. We can go for days in samadhi, but the body is still present. And sooner or later, we go out of samadhi, as it is a state of mind, so it is not permanent. You get it. That's exactly the point I've made many, many times. You've understood it. So maha samadhi, if, again, I have no idea what it is, but if there is in addition to the 7 kinds, there isn't, but if there were such a thing as one more kind of samadhi in addition to what Patanjali describes, and I don't think there is, but if there were such a thing, it would still be a condition of the mind. Samadhi, by definition, is a mental state, a mental condition. And one thing we know for sure is it's pretty easy for us to change our minds. Our minds are constantly changing. So whatever is maha samadhi, it is a transient state of the mind, as all states of the mind are transient. Next question comes from Kartik, who lives in India. I find it hard to stop thinking about work once I come home from the office. Does that sound familiar? Yeah. I also feel a lot of stress at work during the day. Also sounds very familiar. And this has been preventing me from doing spiritual practice. That's an issue. How can I overcome this issue and ensure that I don't fall away from my spiritual practice? So, stress and thinking about work. There's a one-word answer to Kartik's question, and that is meditation. Meditation, meditation, meditation is the solution. And in several ways, a regular practice of meditation will make you more resilient at the office, so that you don't get so stressed out at work, and I'm talking about daily meditation over a period of time, will reduce the amount of stress you feel at the office. If you feel less stress at the office, when you come home, you won't be thinking about it so much. And then if you are thinking about it when you come home, meditate. Kind of it's like, this is a silly metaphor, but meditation is a little bit like a reset switch for the brain, mind. Like on your computers, if your computer isn't working well, what do? Reboot your computer. So in some limited way, meditation could be thought of as kind of rebooting your mind, or what do they say? Refreshing your browser page. How's that? Okay. All right. Next question from, then I'll take some questions here in a minute. Next question from Cody. I read on the internet that some mantra is dangerous, and I should use it only when I've gotten it through initiation from a guru. Is that true? Is everything you read on the internet true? That part is pretty obvious. So the internet is wonderful. I use it lots. I do. But you have to be a discerning user of whatever information you find on the internet. And the way to be discerning is find out what is the source of the information you're reading. So if somebody says that certain mantras are dangerous, who says mantras are dangerous? And how do they know mantras are dangerous? So if you dig a little bit deeper, you'll be surprised sometimes at what you find out. But there is an issue, though, with regard to initiation. First of all, the answer to the question is no mantra is dangerous. Absolute. Mantras are prayers. You understand the meaning of the mantra. Every mantra is a prayer. And obviously a prayer cannot be dangerous. Is it necessary to get initiated with a mantra? And he asks, if this were true, can you suggest any mantra I can use without initiation? You can use any mantra without initiation. There might be, especially in some traditions and with some mantras, which means very limited situations, there might be some cases where initiation carries with it a special value in very restricted cases, but those would be the exception rather than the rule. So in general, you can certainly feel free to use any mantra without initiation. Okay, so we take some questions here. You'll need the microphone.
So I wanted to talk about spiritual bypassing, but more so that, so these teachings are meant to address existential crisis, like death and that stuff. But they also end up helping, like when you have issues of the mind and body, they also address that stuff too. But it's not really meant for that in that sense, because then you would be denying your problems to a degree. So like and I know you would say once you're enlightened, your behavior, like you'd be fueled by dharma. But the thing is that, like, if nothing really, in the end, if there is no problem, why even, like, I still don't get the point of why would one be, like, why would someone have the incentive to even follow dharma? And I don't know.
Okay. How about this? Why wouldn't an enlightened person even have the motivation to get out of bed in the morning? How's that? Because you're asking about motivation.
Okay.
Right?
I think so. I don't know.
That's what I heard.
Okay.
What is it that motivates us to do anything? And ordinary activity is motivated, as you've heard from prior classes, raga and dvesha. I want to go and get what I want, and I want to avoid what I don't want. So that's conventional behavior. And that conventional behavior is completely absent in an enlightened person. When you get out of bed in the morning, you get out of bed for either because of raga or dvesha. Raga because you want to accomplish something during the day. Dvesha because you know if you don't go to work, you're going to get in so much trouble and you want to avoid getting into trouble so raga and dvesha. The enlightened person may have a job, of course, so an enlightened person still needs food and shelter, right? So an enlightened person might have a job, why not? But so then what would motivate the enlightened person to get out of bed? Well, first of all, why do people like to stay in bed? I think this is a more interesting issue. It feels so good. If you've had a good night's sleep and just sleep in general, your bed is comfortable and the room is cold and you're so nice and warm underneath your blanket, so there might be some reluctance. Obviously, the enlightened person won't have any reluctance. So why would the enlightened person be compelled to stay in bed? Wouldn't be compelled to stay in bed. So what would the enlightened person do? Whatever is natural, whatever is normal. So an enlightened person, if he has a job or she has a job, get up and go to work. Do whatever needs to be done. You correctly said, dharma. An enlightened person spontaneously and effortlessly does what needs to be done, which means follows dharma. In a similar way, we can say an enlightened person effortlessly and spontaneously avoids what shouldn't be done, because there's nothing driving that person off the path of dharma. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay. Other questions here? In back? You don't need the microphone. And I don't have the right camera connected, so let's see. Go ahead, please.
Swamiji, different Advaita philosophies, different Vedantic philosophies, including Advaita, like Dvaita, Vishishtadvaita, and there are many more. They are all based on basically the same spiritual texts. Brahma Sutras.
By definition, Upanishads are the primary source.
Okay.
Then there are other secondary sources.
Secondary sources.
Mm-hmm.
But they are all founded on the same basic texts, but they differ so much.
Right.
So
interpretations.
Does it mean that the basic texts are not very clear? Or?
No. What it means is that any text and every text is subject to interpretation. And sometimes the various interpretations are suggested by the text itself. So you can find multiple meanings and conflicting meanings in any text. So then you need to resolve those conflicting meanings. And the way that is done is by determining the whole vision, the context. If you look only at a single line of a text, there's no way of determining its meaning. You need to look at the entire text and find out what is the context developed, so that knowing the context, you can properly interpret the text. But human beings being what they are, we're going to interpret things differently. And what's wrong? First of all, what's wrong with that? No, nothing wrong with that. You have a right to interpret any way you want. Some interpretations may be more helpful. Some interpretations might be less helpful. this is not true this doesn't apply to your question, but some interpretations are deliberately skewed, not with regard to what you're describing, but in other texts and traditions. So this issue of interpretation is a normal human issue. Like in world of this is just the funny example, but in world affairs, such and such a thing happens, but how is that event described? If you look at news sources, a right-leaning news source will describe it in one way, a left-leaning news source will describe it so differently you wonder if they're talking about the same thing. So this is how we human beings just can interpret not just texts, but here, these are actual situations that happen. Some situation happens, and here we have news sources interpreting in such. News sources that are supposed to be objective. Go figure. So that's human nature. Okay, any other questions here? In back, you'll need the microphone.
Does there come a point where existence, Sat, must be negated as well?
It can't be negated. In the absence of Sat, you couldn't ask the question. You see the logical problem? The negator, the one attempting to do negation, exists because of Sat.
So let me rephrase. In the last class, we were talking about repetition, aham brahmasmi. But if we just take the first part of that, aham, I am, does there come a point where that must be negated?
No. Why?
Well, is I am...
I.
Is I not something that appears in consciousness? Is something that we can kind of be aware of, in a sense?
Well, there are two. Remember, sit down, and I'll try to answer your questions. So I is a pronoun, right? So which I are you referring to? If I refers to Satchidananda Atma, no need to negate that. If I refers to the body and mind, and you know that it's only a thought, there's no need to negate it. Listen to that very carefully. As said, if I refers to the body and mind, but you know it's only a thought. We call this enlightened ahankara. You've heard this, I think, in other classes. And it's not a problem. So there's I is not your enemy. You're talking about negation. In fact, no thought is your enemy. The only problem, as we've said, is ignorance. So if there's anything we want to negate, it's ignorance. And as I said, to attempt to negate Sat is a logical impossibility. Does that address your question? Okay. Let's take a few more online, and then I'll come back to our local students. Next question from Arun, who lives in Bangalore. In our last week's satsang, I said that Hanumanji may not have been a historic character. Actually, that's not what I said. What I said is that in the Hanuman Chalisa, it describes Hanumanji as a child flying up in the sky towards the sun and thinking that the sun is a fruit and eating it, right? That's what I said is not true. I didn't say Hanumanji was not a historic character. I said that some of these stories may not be historic. And I gave that as an example of a non-historical story. Hanuman eating the sun. Staying with the Ramayana, have you ever seen monkeys and bears building a bridge? I mean, that's such a famous story in the Ramayana, but we know very well monkeys and bears don't build bridges. So I would say then that that's another example of a non-historic story. I didn't say that the Ramayana was fiction. It's not. It is an epic. It is itihasa. It has a historical basis. And here's the problem. We have a tendency to oversimplify things. If you ask, is the Ramayana truth or fiction? Is the Ramayana historical or mythological? It's more complicated than that. And the way to understand the complexity is to understand story and storytelling. So these are epics, Ramayana and Mahabharata. These epics evolved, and there's a lot of scholarship behind this. I'm not making any of this up, but obviously, the Mahabharata is about 100,000 verses long. How long would it take Vyasa to compose 100,000 verses? One lifetime won't be enough. So let's get a little realistic about our scriptures, and especially about the epics, Ramayana and Mahabharata, and Puranas will include along with that. So these are scriptures which include. Oh, okay. All right. I think there's a problem with recording, but I think the stream is continuing without any trouble. Okay. Sorry. So let's consider the Ramayana and Mahabharata, which we call epics. The technical term is itihasa, historical scriptures. And then we also have Puranas. What's interesting, first of all, is that the Puranas are not called itihasa. The Puranas are not even called historical. Why? Because when I gave the example the other day, when Brahmaji and Lord Vishnu get in a big argument about who is mightier, and that's described in the, I think maybe Skanda Purana, Shiva Purana, I'm not sure exactly where. Did that argument take place on a Tuesday or Thursday, in the morning or in the evening? You get the point that Puranic stories are not historical. If they were historical, wouldn't we call Puranas itihasa? Itihasa, by the way, for those of you who don't know Sanskrit, itihasa is the Sanskrit term for history. So, the Puranas, by definition, are not historical, which means, and let's make this point very clear before I continue, to call them non-historical doesn't mean they have no value. And this is where people go off. Works that are non-historical can convey tremendous meaning and have tremendous value. An example you've heard me give before is there are some novels which have been written that you can learn so much from those novels. They can change your life. It's a non-historical story, fiction. A fictional story can impart tremendous wisdom. I think everyone will agree with that. So to say that the non-historical nature of the Puranas, to say that it reduces it to some kind of ancient mythology which is just useless, that's a wrong conclusion. Absolutely wrong conclusion. So the Purana literally means old. So the Puranas contain these old stories which are not historical, but which convey tremendous wisdom. Now, having examined the Puranas, we then turn to the Mahabharata and Ramayana, more complicated. So they are called itihasa. They are history. But now we have to understand a problem with history, in fact, more a problem with historians. They say that historians record exactly. Let me ask a rhetorical question. Do history books record things exactly as they occurred? There's no such thing as a history book which is 100% accurate. So we know that the personal orientation of the historian will have some effect on the stories being told, on the events, historical events being described. So first of all, we recognize that when historical events are recognized, they can be represented in various ways. Number one. Number two, I'm smiling because this is just such a nice recognition. Suppose you were a historian in ancient India, or a storyteller, because it's a history of stories. So you're a storyteller in ancient India, and you're telling your story, and you're telling your story, and you notice that people in your audience are starting to fall asleep. Happens to me. So what do you do if you're telling a story and people are starting to fall asleep? You spice it up, to use the American expression. You have to make it sound more interesting. And that's exactly what happened. That the great saints and sages who told and retold the story of the Mahabharata and Ramayana, told and retold these stories generation after generation after generation, you can be absolutely sure that they spiced it up here and there. And that's what we then end up with, is a historically true core story with a lot of stuff added in. That's an accurate depiction of the Ramayana and Mahabharata. So there had to have been a historical Rama and Sita, and even Hanuman. Whether Hanuman was really like a monkey or not, maybe that part was added on. I don't know. By the way, there's no way of knowing. There's no way to prove that Hanuman's monkey nature was added or not. How would we even begin? But what we can say for sure is that flying in the sky and eating the sun, and monkeys and bears building bridges, without doubt, such things were added on to make the stories more interesting. The last point, there was another question. I don't think I have it right here. But somebody asked, nice question. I forget it. I don't have it here. But he said that if you're going to treat Hanuman in this way, then how can we make Hanuman our Ishta Devata? How can we pray to Hanuman? If Hanuman is God, and if Hanuman can't fly and eat the sun, then how can I make Hanuman my Ishta Devata? This is another very different issue. And it has a lot to do with culture and Shraddha. And those of you who heard last week's Satsang, you know that the person who believed that Hanumanji really did fly and eat the sun, you remember that I treated him with respect. I even praised him for his tremendous Shraddha. his faith. And I think those who have such strong Shraddha have a tremendous blessing. So what I would, I forget, I don't have the questioner in front of me, but the questioner asks, how can I make Hanumanji my Ishta Devata? And the answer is, if you have as much Shraddha as the questioner did last week, there's no problem. If you have that Shraddha, make Hanumanji your Ishta Devata. If you don't have that Shraddha, then maybe find another Ishta Devata. I'm just being very realistic and acknowledging a fact that I think some Hindus are reluctant to acknowledge the fact that this kind of intense Shraddha, which properly speaking is Andha Vishwasa, blind faith. It is. This Andha Vishwasa has been an integral part of the Hindu tradition for centuries and centuries and centuries. But you've noticed, I'm sure you've all noticed, that it's decreasing rapidly. And it's likely, before long, for the Hindu community, both in India and the diaspora, in another 100 years, will anyone have that Andha Vishwasa? I'm not sure, but I think it's unlikely. Which means two things. Means the Hindu tradition doesn't depend on blind faith. That's really important. The Hindu tradition doesn't depend on blind faith. The rishis, we call them wise men. Wisdom, we didn't call them believers. Look at other religions. True believer. That's very important in some traditions. A true believer, one who has unquestioning faith. Is that how we look upon the rishis? We say we call them wise men. The Sanskrit term is Krantadarshi. They can see beyond. They can see more clearly than anyone else. They know the difference between what is real and what is not real. My point is, the Hindu tradition doesn't depend on Andha Vishwasa. And in modern times, now that we live in a very scientifically oriented culture and time, the number of people who maintain this blind faith are decreasing in number, and it's a reasonable assumption that the number will continue to decrease. So, and the point is, that's not a problem. It's absolutely okay. The message of the Ramayana doesn't depend on the historicity. Listen very carefully, and I'll finish this question. The message of the Ramayana does not, the teachings of the Ramayana, doesn't depend on the historicity of Hanumanji eating the sun, doesn't depend on the historicity of monkeys and bears building a bridge. That I think that is a solid statement of truth. Okay, let's see a couple more questions here. Next question is from Neil, who lives in North Carolina. Neil asks, the problem of ignorance is in the mind, and the solution to ignorance is also in the mind. Correct. Then how can enlightenment be possible? Good question. He says, if bondage and moksha both belong to the mind, belong is maybe not the right word, then how can moksha be permanent since the mind is always fickle, ever-changing? That's true. Mind is ever-changing. In which case, knowledge of Atma may be like fleeting flashes or sparks of light. Okay, here's a misunderstanding. The mind is indeed fickle. We all know it too well. Fortunately, the role of Vedanta in enlightenment is, I'm sorry to sound philosophical here, but I'll start with this. It's purely in the form of negation. We speak in terms of giving you spiritual knowledge, and that's a common expression, but it ends up being a process of removal. You've all heard neti neti. Not this, not this. And neti neti is really the essential teaching of Vedanta. Let me explain it very briefly, and then we can answer Neil's question more clearly. Here's the perspective of Advaita Vedanta. Your true nature is already Satchidananda Atma. You don't become that. Your true nature is divine. You don't become divine. Your true nature is vast, limitless, full and complete. It's an already existent fact, but it's unrecognized, as though covered by a veil of ignorance. So, Atma doesn't need to get enlightened. Atma is already full and complete. The problem is the so-called veil of ignorance. When that ignorance is removed, let me turn it into a question. After removing the so-called veil of ignorance that prevents you from recognizing your true nature as Satchidananda Atma, after removing that ignorance, what else do you need before you get enlightened? And that's a trick question. I'll say it again. After removing the ignorance that prevents you from recognizing your true nature as Satchidananda Atma, after removing that ignorance, using the teachings of Vedanta, knowledge destroys ignorance, right? So after the knowledge, the spiritual wisdom of Vedanta destroys that particular ignorance, that so-called veil of ignorance covering Atma. Once that veil has been removed, what else do you need before you get enlightened? And I think you've figured it out by now. Nothing. It's over. That is called enlightenment. So here's the point. Moksha, both bondage and moksha, as Neil correctly says, belong to the mind. He says belong, and that's okay. That's actually okay. They belong to the mind. That is to say, bondage is due to ignorance in the mind. Moksha is due to the removal of ignorance from the mind. Ignorance has its locus in the mind, and the solution has to be where the problem is. The problem is in the mind. The locus of the solution must also be in the mind. But notice then that enlightenment, that moksha, is the removal of ignorance. It's not endowing your... Moksha is not a state of perpetual bliss. People like to talk about the state of enlightenment. Like you have a different state of... You're in a good mood, you're in a bad mood, you're in an enlightened mood. That's silly, right? Enlightenment is not a mood. Enlightenment is not a state of mind. States of mind absolutely change. Neil is completely correct about that. Enlightenment is not a state of mind, as we've just discussed. Enlightenment is the removal of that so-called veil of ignorance. Which is to say then, enlightenment doesn't give you anything, it removes something. In fact, it removes the source of suffering. You had a question before. Shall we take your question? Okay. Okay. Then let me finish up with a few more questions here. Next from Divas, who lives in California. Currently, reflection on the world being of lesser reality than consciousness Brahman, can it be concluded that if there were no consciousness, whatever changing world existed would not be known, since unchanging consciousness enables that knowing? Then why is it a higher reality than the world? I'm not sure if I even fully understand that. First of all, there's a problem in asking questions when I think our brilliant philosophers call it a contrary hypothetical. You say, if grass was blue, then so if you begin an argument, you say, suppose grass was the color blue, then what? Well, that's a pretty weak way of starting an argument. And here he says, if there were no consciousness, is a little bit like that. It's not a very constructive way of beginning an argument. And to apply, if there were no consciousness, and get the picture of Vedanta. Consciousness is Brahman. You may have heard the Mahavakya from the Rig Veda is Prajnanam Brahma. Prajnana means consciousness. So he says, if there were no consciousness, consciousness is Brahman. If there were no Brahman, if there's no Brahman, what would exist? Okay. That's the idea. So I'm not sure I've answered the question, but that's, I think, the best I can do. Next question comes from Goitom, who lives in Ethiopia. Interesting. I have seen many of your videos and learned a lot from them. In one of our satsangs, I said that the mind is a product of brain activities. I've said that. Mind is a product of brain. Based on this, I have come to a conclusion that there is no subtle body which travels from one lifetime to the next. Is my understanding correct? Very interesting question. Let me try to answer it. First of all, that's absolutely the perspective of science. Science deals with that which is observable. What's interesting there is that the mind cannot be directly observed, right? Can a scientist observe your mind? There's an old joke here, and the joke is even the most highly trained psychiatrist, you walk into the office of the most highly trained psychiatrist, and the first thing he'll do is say, so what's on your mind? Yeah, he has to ask you. He has no idea. You get my point, and that is science deals with what is observable. The brain is observable. Brain activities, neural activities are observable. We can, in fact, the language used by scientists is they make correlations between a person's experience and what's happening in their brain. You just notice that that in fact, also it's a lot statistical. A scientist will say 90% of the time, when this part of the brain does that, the person experiences this. That's neuroscience. Notice 90% of the time, because science deals with statistics. Usually it's not 1 or a 0. It's more complex than that. So the scientists will say there is a strong correlation between a certain kind of experience in the mind. There's a strong correlation between certain mental experiences and certain brain activities. This field of study is expanding rapidly. Usually we're just at the very beginning of it. In 100 or 200 years, it's going to be so amazing what they discover. But here and further, actually I'll come to that in just a moment. Will the scientists ever be able to directly examine your mind? Notice they're examining brain activities, and then they ask the person, did you experience this? Did you experience that? So they get the person's experience secondhand. Only secondhand, by asking the person. They have no first-hand access, which means it's not a direct observation, it's an indirect observation. Science has no direct way of observing your mind. So even when I said that the mind is a product of the brain, that's a scientific perspective, but please note that the mind is not an entity that can be directly observed and scientifically studied. By the way, that's why a lot of scientists criticize psychology. They call it a soft science, and they use that as a derogatory term. And they call it a soft science. A chemist or someone who's in the field of physics, they constantly put down psychology, soft science. Why? You can't directly observe. You can observe particles, you can observe chemicals, you can't observe directly the mind. So it's called soft science. So therefore, even science has its limitations on this particular topic. Now, in the ancient Hindu worldview, they didn't know anything about the brain and its connection to mental activities. And they had a description of the world which preceded scientific knowledge, a pre-scientific view of the world. Part of that pre-scientific view of the world included an entity known as sukshma sharira, subtle body. By the way, the subtle body includes mind. Other elements are there as well. That basically that which enlivens a physical body is called subtle body. So it would include things like life force and mental activities and your powers of sensation. All of this stuff collectively is known as subtle body, sukshma sharira. But let's focus on mind. And it is that sukshma sharira that is said to leave a physical body at the time of death and travel on to a new body. Now, where was the name? Gautam here says that is my understanding correct that there is no subtle body based on our discussion so far? And what I have to ask is, tell me, how will you prove there's no subtle body? Because the subtle body is not an entity that can be observed directly and studied scientifically. Just like mind, let me ask you, how do you know you have a mind? Or better yet, how do you know I have a mind? How do you know for sure that I'm not a really sophisticated robot, just with so much artificial. My intelligence is artificial. How's that? That I am just a glorious creation of scientists who have made me seem so realistic and endowed me with so much artificial intelligence. How can you know for sure? You presume I'm a human being like you. Can you prove it? Yeah, this is the issue. We make presumptions we can't prove. So, you presume I am a conscious being with a mind like you. You can't prove it. Mind is different. You know you have your mind. You know that your mind exists because you have direct access. You experienced your mind, so there's no question that your mind exists. But with regard to my mind, you can't prove, you can't disprove. You can presume, make an assumption. And the same argument applies to Sukshma Sharira. As we said, mind is an important element of Sukshma Sharira. You can't prove that the Sukshma Sharira exists. You can't prove that it doesn't exist. If you have a scientific orientation, you presume it doesn't exist. On the other hand, if you're studying ancient teachings in which the existence of the Sukshma Sharira was assumed. In ancient times, they assumed the existence. They didn't prove it, they assumed it existed. Then if you want to understand what they're teaching, you have to look at it through their lens. You have to think like they thought to understand what... I'm not saying that you have to assume the existence of Sukshma Sharira. I'm not saying that. What I am saying, you have to understand that these teachings assume the existence of Sukshma Sharira, and you have to deal with that. And you also have to recognize that whether you assume Sukshma Sharira exists or you assume it doesn't exist, both are assumptions. It's not provable because it's not provable in a scientific sense because it's not observable. Okay, let's take a couple of short questions. Let's see. This question from Amit in India. We have departmentalized or anthropomorphized, I love these words. We departmentalize or anthropomorphize gods. Brahmaji is a creator. Lord Vishnu maintains the universe. Lord Shiva destroys the universe. Goddess Lakshmi gives us money. Goddess Saraswati gives us knowledge. And he goes on and on. I don't see a question here. He goes on to say that a lot of our devotional practices are based on highly anthropomorphized forms of God. On our altar is Sri Krishna. He appears to have 2 arms, 1 head, 2 legs, right? He's holding a flute. How anthropomorphic is that? And even, Lord Shiva, Vishnu has 4 arms, fine, they're still arms. Notice they're not tentacles. So I suppose if we were like squids, our gods would have tentacles, but we are human beings. So this is normal. And I guess the simple fact of the matter is, and I give you the Vedantic perspective is this, Many people have difficulty worshiping a formless God. That's a fact. Many people need form. And nothing wrong with that. Absolutely nothing wrong with that. Any form of devotion is wonderful. Whether you are devoted to God without form, whether you are devoted to God with a particular form, devotion is crucial. And if you can't worship God without form, then you must worship God with some form. What form? Certainly not a God with tentacles. We can't relate. So the various forms of God that we worship are chosen because they're forms that we can relate to, which is important for our devotional life. Maybe just this one last question, I think we'll conclude then. This is from Ahmad, who lives in Vancouver, Canada. His question is it normal or even expected to encounter the fear of enlightenment on the path to moksha? I've never experienced any kind of fear, nor do I think it's even possible to experience fear, because moksha, some people fear like non-existence, annihilation. People fear death. Many people fear death. In fact, most people fear death. Moksha is not death. Moksha is not annihilation. And I think the strongest example I can give is the closest thing we experience in life, the closest thing to being dead or to being annihilated is dreamless sleep. Do you fear dreamless sleep? And it's so significant. No one fears it. We all love it. So, but think about it. In deep sleep, are you aware of having a body? In deep sleep, thoughts, emotions? Nothing. That's pretty close to being dead or annihilated. Yet, our experience is blissful. So for that reason, I don't think it's possible to have a fear. Since enlightenment is to discover your true nature, what remains in deep sleep is you in your true nature. Body is gone for the time being, mind is gone for the time being. What remains is you in your fundamental, essential nature, and I don't see how any fear could arise. Okay, this is probably a good place to conclude for today. We'll continue with more questions next week.